the first time Eliza Calloway placed a bid at the Harrow Creek town auction. Her voice shook so badly that old Pete Dunmore cupped his ear and asked her to repeat herself. And from 3 rows back, a broad-shouldered cowboy in a dust-worn brown hat leaned forward and watched with an expression that nobody could quite read. It was the spring of 1878, and Harrow Creek, Texas, was the kind of town that sat at the edge of the frontier like a man who had not quite decided whether to stay or move on. The main street was a strip of hard-packed earth lined with a general store, a livery stable, a saloon that doubled as a makeshift courtroom on Sundays, and a collection of wooden storefronts that leaned against each other for support the way tired men do after a long day. The surrounding land was flat and wide and golden, cut through by a shallow river that flooded every March and dried to a trickle every August, and the sky above it was the kind of blue that seemed too large for any single person to fully comprehend. The town auction happened on the first Saturday of every month. Pete Dunmore ran it from a raised platform at the north end of the street, and people came from as far as 30 miles out to sell goods, buy equipment, trade livestock, and bid on the parcels of land that occasionally came available when someone gave up and moved on. It was the heartbeat of the town, a gathering that was equal parts commerce and community, and it drew everyone from the wealthiest ranchers to the most struggling homesteaders. Eliza Calloway was 24 years old, and she had arrived in Harrow Creek 8 months earlier with a wagon, a mule named Arthur, 2 trunks of household belongings, and a land deed to 40 acres northeast of town that she had inherited from her Uncle Harold when he died of fever the previous summer. She had never farmed in her life. She had grown up in Galveston, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a seamstress mother, and her hands had been accustomed to books and needle and thread, not soil and fence posts and stubborn livestock. But her uncle's land was the only thing she had left after her parents both passed within 6 months of each other, and she was not the kind of woman who gave up on something simply because it was difficult. The people of Harrow Creek had not known quite what to make of her at first. A young woman, alone, trying to work a homestead. Some were kind, some were skeptical. And some, like Garrett Holt, who owned the largest cattle operation in the county, and seemed to believe that the land northeast of town rightfully belonged to him as part of some eventual expansion he had planned for years, were openly hostile. Garrett Holt was 51 years old, thick-necked, with small eyes that sat too close together and a smile that never reached them. He had money, influence, and a habit of getting what he wanted. He had approached Eliza twice in her first month in town to offer to buy her uncle's land, and both times she had politely but firmly declined. After the second refusal, his tone had changed in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The auction was the mechanism through which Holt had decided to pursue the matter more aggressively. He had learned through his connections at the county seat that Harold Calloway had carried a small outstanding debt at the time of his death, a sum related to some disputed water rights, and through a series of legal maneuvers that Eliza did not fully understand, Holt had arranged for a portion of her livestock and farm equipment to be put up for auction to settle that debt. It was not entirely legal. It was not entirely right. But the judge who might have prevented it owed Holt 3 favors, and so the auction was announced, and the items were listed, and Eliza stood in line at Pete Dunmore's platform one Saturday morning in April with her jaw set, and her eyes dry because she had spent all her tears the night before and had none left for public display. She needed her plow. She needed her seeding equipment. She needed the second mule, whose name was Beatrice, because Arthur alone could not work the fields that needed to be ready by May if she was going to have any harvest at all. Without those things, she could not work the land. Without working the land, she could not make any income. Without income, she would lose the property within a year, and Garrett Holt knew it, and the auction was precisely his way of beginning that process. Eliza had saved $42, which represented every cent she had to her name. She had calculated that the plow would likely go for around $15, the seating equipment for around 12, and Beatrice, who was young and strong, for perhaps 20 to 25. It was tight. It was dangerously tight. And she knew that Holt, or whoever he sent to represent him, would bid those prices up. She took her place in the crowd as the auction began, and she was so focused on mentally rehearsing her strategy that she did not notice the man who sat down on the wooden bench beside her until he set his hat on his knee, and she caught the motion from the corner of her eye. He was tall even sitting down, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of hard outdoor work. His hair was dark brown, a little long at the collar, and his face carried the quiet sun-carved lines of a man who spent most of his life outside. She guessed he was around 28 or 30. His eyes, when he glanced at her briefly before looking back toward the platform, were a dark amber color that reminded her of creek water in autumn, warm and deep, and a little unclear about what lay beneath the surface. She had seen him before. Everyone in Harrow Creek had seen Cole Aldridge, even if they had not all spoken to him at length. He was a ranch hand who worked for no single employer but instead hired himself out for various jobs across the county, breaking horses, mending fences, helping with roundups. He was known to be capable, quiet, and fair in his dealings. He was not from Texas originally. She had heard someone say Kansas or maybe Missouri. He lived in a small rented room above the livery stable and ate most of his meals at Me's boarding house down the street, and beyond those facts, Eliza knew very little about him. She gave him a polite nod of acknowledgement and turned her attention back to the platform. The auction progressed through a series of smaller items: a saddle, some tools, a set of cooking pots that made Eliza feel a pang of sadness on behalf of whoever had parted with them. And then Pete Dunmore called out the listing for a horse-drawn plow in fair working condition, and Eliza's hands tightened in her lap. She bid $12. A man near the back bid $14. She bid $15. Garrett Holt's ranch foreman, a wiry fellow named Dale Sims, raised his hand and bid $18. Eliza felt the number settle on her chest like a stone. She could go to 20, maybe 22, but that would leave her almost nothing for the other two items. And then the man beside her, without looking at her, raised his hand and said, in a voice that was calm and certain the way a good fence post is certain, $25. Dale Sims frowned. He bid $27. Cole Aldridge bid $30. Sims looked toward the edge of the crowd where Holt was standing, and Holt gave a small shake of his head. Sims sat back. Pete Dunmore brought his hammer down. The plow went to Cole Aldridge for $30. Eliza turned to look at him, her brow furrowed, her mouth already forming a polite but confused thank you. He was looking straight ahead at the platform. He reached into his shirt pocket, produced a folded piece of paper, unfolded it, and passed it to her without comment. She looked down. It was a receipt made out in neat handwriting. For $30. She looked up at him. He met her eyes briefly, and there was something in his expression that was careful and sincere and a little guarded all at once. "I am buying it on your behalf," he said quietly. "You can pay me back whenever. There is no hurry." She did not know what to say. The words she had prepared for a polite refusal of charity died somewhere between her mind and her mouth, because this did not feel entirely like charity. It felt like something else. Something that had a particular quality of deliberateness to it. "Why?" she managed. He looked back at the platform. "Because I have been watching Holt run people off their land for 3 years, and I am tired of watching it." It was a practical answer. It was the kind of answer that asked for nothing in return and made no promises and had no flourish to it. And yet it stayed with her for the rest of the morning in a way that she could not fully explain. Cole Aldridge sat beside her through the rest of that auction, and when the seating equipment came up, he bid on that too, quietly pushing Dale Sims out of the running each time. And when Beatrice the mule was led to the platform, he waited until Sims had bid $20 and then raised his hand and said 28 with the same calm certainty, and Sims gave up entirely. At the end of the auction, Cole arranged for all 3 items to be delivered to Eliza's property, settled the accounting with Pete Dunmore with quiet efficiency, and then put his hat back on his head and was halfway to the livery stable before Eliza caught up with him. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, a little breathless because she had been moving fast to match his long stride. He stopped and turned. "I want to thank you properly, and I want to discuss what I owe you and how I intend to repay it, because I do intend to repay it, all of it." He studied her for a moment. The afternoon light was behind her and caught in her dark hair in a way that he probably did not let himself think about for more than a second. "I know you do," he said. "You have that look about you." "What look is that?" "The look of someone who pays their debts." She extended her hand and he shook it, and the handshake was firm on both sides, and she told him she would have his money within 2 harvests if she managed things right, and he said that was more than acceptable, and they parted ways with the whole thing settled in the practical, straightforward manner that the frontier demanded. But she thought about him that evening, while she was feeding Arthur and Beatrice in the small barn behind her house, and she thought about the way he had sat beside her without being asked, without making a production of it, without expecting anything, and the thought had a warmth to it that she filed carefully away like something fragile that she was not yet sure what to do with. The following month's auction arrived on the first Saturday of May, and this time the items being sold included a section of fencing equipment, and a small but important piece of land that sat between Eliza's northeast parcel and the river, a strip of about 3 acres that had been abandoned by a man named Fletcher who had packed up and gone to California. That land mattered because it contained the only reliable water access within half a mile of Eliza's property. Without it, irrigation in the summer months would become nearly impossible. She had $31. Cole had not yet asked her for anything toward repayment, though she had mentioned it twice, and he had deflected both times with the same unhurried patience. She sat down at the auction and felt the familiar tightening in her chest as Pete Dunmore opened the bidding on the river access strip at $5. And then the bench beside her shifted under familiar weight, and she looked sideways and Cole Aldridge was there, settling his hat on his knee, looking at the platform. She did not say anything at first. She simply looked at him for a moment, and he seemed to know she was looking without turning his head. "You do not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "I have some money this time. I can go to at least 30 on this one." "Good. Let us see how far Sims is willing to push it." That word, "us," settled quietly between them without either of them acknowledging it. Sims pushed the bidding to $38 before Cole entered it at 42, and Sims, either under different instructions than the previous month or simply unwilling to spend more of Holt's money on a 3-acre strip, sat down. The land went to Cole at $42, and Cole turned to Eliza and said he would deed it over to her property at the county registrar's office the following week, and she told him she had $22 she could put toward it right now, and he accepted the 22 without argument. As they were walking away from the platform together after the auction, she asked him a question that she had been quietly assembling since the previous month. "Why does Holt want my land specifically? There is plenty of open country around here." Cole was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was choosing his words deliberately rather than stalling. "Your uncle's 40 acres sit on top of what a surveyor told Holt last year is the best groundwater source in this part of the county. And your uncle's 40 acres connect directly to the eastern grazing range that Holt has been trying to consolidate for his herd expansion. He needs that land, not just wants it. And the previous owners," Cole's jaw shifted slightly. "There have been 4 homesteaders on properties adjacent to Holt's over the past 3 years. All 4 ended up selling. 2 of them were pressured through exactly the kind of legal maneuvering he is trying on you. One had a fire that was never officially explained. The last one, a Mexican family named Ruiz, was run off by men Holt employed, and no one in this county did a thing about it because the judge was in Holt's pocket and the sheriff was afraid of him." Eliza was quiet. The injustice of it had a particular sharp quality, the way it spread across different people, different circumstances, but had the same ugly hand behind it every time. "And you," she said, "why have you not left? 3 years watching this and you have stayed." He looked at her. "Because someone needs to." That evening she sat on her porch in the last of the daylight with a cup of coffee that had gone cool and thought about Cole Aldridge the way she had told herself she would not think about him. He was not a man who advertised himself. He did not tell stories about his past, did not take up space in a room with his personality, did not perform his own goodness for an audience. He was simply present when things needed to be done, and he did them, and then he went back to his life without ceremony. She found that quality magnetic in a way that her more reasonable self tried to temper. He was helping her because of a principle. That was a different thing from caring about her specifically. She told herself that firmly and went to bed. In June, she had her first real yield from the spring planting. It was modest, a partial harvest of corn and some early beans, but it was enough to take $40 to the county registrar's office and put it toward the water access land deed, which Cole had already filed the transfer paperwork for at his own expense. She brought the receipt to the livery stable where he was working on a saddle in the late afternoon, the light coming gold and sideways through the open doors, and she set the receipt on the workbench beside him. He looked at it, looked at her. "You did not need to come all the way to town for this." "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He set down the leather tool he was holding and picked up the receipt and folded it into his shirt pocket with the careful precision of a man who did not misplace things. "Your planting went well, better than I expected. I made some mistakes in March that I corrected in April, and the corn responded well once I figured out the drainage situation along the east fence line." He nodded slowly. "You are figuring it out. I am stubborn enough to." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the beginning of the idea of one. "I know," he said. "I noticed." She was aware in that moment that she was standing closer to him than was entirely necessary given the size of the livery stable. She was also aware that he had not stepped back. She cleared her throat and said she had to get back before dark, and he said to be careful on the northeast road because one of the bridge planks was loose, and she said she would, and she left. But she kept glancing back once, which she would not have done if she had better discipline, and he was still standing in the doorway watching her go, and he looked away as soon as she looked back, which told her something that she did not quite know what to do with yet. July brought the second auction, and this time Holt changed his approach. Rather than sending Dale Sims, he came himself, in his good coat and his expensive boots, and he stationed himself at the front of the crowd with the settled ease of a man who expected the day to go his way. The item in question was a water pump and the associated piping equipment that Eliza needed desperately for the summer irrigation. Without it, hauling water by hand from the river access strip would consume most of her working hours during the dry months. With it, she could keep her crops alive and herself sane. Cole was already seated when she arrived at the auction. He had saved her a place on the bench, which he had not done before, not overtly. He had simply arrived first and left a space, and she sat down and understood what the space meant and felt warmth bloom in her chest at the understated deliberateness of it. "He came himself," she said quietly, nodding toward Holt. Cole's eyes tracked to Holt and back without expression. "He is annoyed," he said. "Good. He has more money than either of us." "He does," Cole agreed. "But money is not the only thing a person bids with." She did not entirely understand what he meant by that until the bidding on the water pump began, and Holt opened personally at $15 with the comfortable authority of a man who expected the room to acknowledge his dominance. Cole waited through 3 rounds of escalation between other bidders and Holt, and then when the price reached $32 and Holt raised his hand for $35 with a small, satisfied smile, Cole said 42 without any change in his posture or expression. Holt turned and looked at him for the first time, and what happened in that exchange was visible to everyone watching. Holt recognized Cole, and Cole held his gaze with the kind of steady, unflinching calm that was more unsettling than aggression would have been. It was the look of a man who had already decided what he was willing to do and was not troubled by the decision. 50, Holt said, still looking at Cole. "60, Cole said. The crowd was very quiet. Pete Dunmore looked between the two men with the alert concern of someone who had seen this kind of standoff escalate before. Holt's jaw tightened. 70. Cole said 85 and did not blink. Eliza's heart was hammering. $85 was an enormous sum. She turned to Cole and said in a low, urgent voice, "Cole, that is too much, you cannot." 85 going once, Pete said. Holt looked at Cole again, searching for some sign of limit, some hesitation. Cole gave him nothing. Going twice. Holt's nostrils flared. He said nothing. The hammer came down. The water pump went to Cole Aldridge for $85, and Garrett Holt walked away from the platform with his face carefully controlled but his neck very red. And Dale Sims followed him with the expression of a man who knew there would be consequences for this loss, but could not determine who they would fall on. Eliza sat very still. Cole settled back on the bench and let out a slow breath that was the only sign he gave that the exchange had cost him anything. "That was a great deal of money," she said. "It was. Cole." She said his name with a particular weight that made him look at her, really look at her instead of at the platform. "Where does that money come from? You hire out for odd jobs. Even good wages would not produce that kind of sum repeatedly." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, before I came to Harrow Creek, I worked a cattle drive from Missouri to Dodge City 3 years in a row, saved most of what I made. I did not have much to spend it on." "You are spending it on me." "I'm spending it on a principle," he said, and then quieter, "and on you." She held his gaze. He did not look away, and in the space between them on that wooden bench, in the middle of all those people and the dust of the auction grounds and the July heat that pressed on everything, something clarified between them that neither of them had yet put into words, but that was no longer deniable. "I intend to pay back every single cent," she said, her voice softer now. "I know you do," he said. And the way he said it had more than practical acknowledgement in it. It had something tender in it, the way a man's voice gets when he is saying one thing and meaning a great many others. She looked at her hands in her lap and then back at him. "Why are you really doing this?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because you should not have to fight this alone." That evening, after she had driven her wagon back to the property and unloaded the water pump with Arthur's help and gotten the pipes sorted for installation the next day, she sat on her porch again, and this time the coffee did not go cold because she was too awake to let anything cool down. Her mind kept returning to the way he had said that, "Because you should not have to fight this alone." It was a simple statement. It was also the most intimate thing anyone had said to her in years. The following morning, Cole appeared at her property before she had finished breakfast. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of a horse coming up the northeast road, and she came to the doorway with her coffee cup and watched him dismount at the fence with the easy practiced motion of someone who had been getting on and off horses his entire life. He tied his horse, a quiet roan mare named Kasia, to the fence post, and then he looked up and saw her in the doorway and gave a small nod. "Thought you might need help with the installation," he said. She could have said she had it managed. She could have maintained the careful distance that she had been telling herself was prudent. Instead, she stepped back from the doorway and said, "I have extra coffee." He came inside, and it was the first time he had been inside her home, and she watched him take it in with the quiet attentiveness he gave to most things. The single large room with the kitchen at one end, and the table in the middle and the bookshelf she had built herself from planks and nails that held her father's books, which she had hauled all the way from Galveston because they were the things she could not leave behind. He looked at the bookshelf for a moment, and she watched something in his face soften. "Those are your father's?" he asked. She startled slightly. "How did you know?" "You told me, Hendricks, at the boarding house when you first arrived that you had carried your father's books across Texas." She mentioned it. He looked at the titles. Dickens, a volume of poetry, a farming almanac that did not belong to her father but that she had bought herself, a history of the Republic of Texas. He was a teacher, a school teacher, in Galveston. She set a cup of coffee on the table. He believed very strongly that reading was the mechanism by which a person made sense of the world. Cole sat down at the table. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at her. He was right. You read, when I can get books, he paused. There is not much available out here. You could borrow some of mine. She said it before she had fully decided to say it, and he looked at her with a careful, wondering expression. I would like that, he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness of it, made something in her chest feel very full. They spent the morning installing the water pump together, which involved a great deal of muddy ground around the pipeline trench and some engineering problems at the connection point that Cole solved with a piece of iron rework that Eliza never would have thought of. And by noon, they had a functioning irrigation line running from the river access strip to the nearest field. And it worked, water flowing steadily and clean. And Eliza put her hands over her mouth when it came through and then laughed. And the laugh caught Cole off guard in the best possible way, because his whole face changed when he heard it, opened up the way a room does when someone throws back the curtains. They ate lunch on her porch. She had bread and dried beef and some early tomatoes from the garden, and they sat in the shade with the water pump running in the distance and the sound of the land around them, the wind, the birds, the creak of the fence in the breeze, and they talked for the first time without any practical urgency driving the conversation. He told her about Kansas, about growing up on a farm that his father had worked until the drought years in the early 1870s stripped it down to nothing, and his father had sold and moved to a city and never been at peace again. About how Cole had understood from that experience that the land itself was not the enemy, but that the systems built around it could be, the debts and the legal structures and the powerful men who understood how to use those systems as weapons. She told him about Galveston, about her mother's sewing room that always smelled of lavender and cut cloth, about her father reading aloud in the evenings, about the specific particular loneliness of arriving in a place that was entirely unfamiliar and having to build everything from the beginning. Were you frightened? He asked. When you first came here, she thought about it honestly. Every single day for the first 3 months, she said. I cried into my pillow every night because I could not let myself do it during the day. He nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone who understood that kind of discipline. And now, she looked out at her fields, the irrigation line doing its quiet work, the corn standing green in the July heat. Now I am frightened maybe every other day, she said. It is an improvement. He almost smiled. The almost smile had become something she found herself watching for, the slight shift at the corner of his mouth that was the predecessor to something warmer. In August, a new problem arrived in the form of 2 men who showed up at Eliza's property on a Tuesday morning while Cole was not there, men she did not recognize but whose horses carried Holt's brand. They did not threaten her directly. They walked her fence line, pointed at the water pump installation, made comments to each other in voices low enough that she could not make out the words, and then rode away without speaking to her at all. The whole encounter took perhaps 15 minutes, and it was designed to unsettle her, and it did. She drove to town that afternoon and found Cole at the livery. She told him what had happened without making it more dramatic than it was, just the facts, simply stated, and she watched his expression go careful and still in the way it did when he was processing something that he had feelings about but was choosing not to express all of them. He went to see Sheriff Brady that afternoon. Brady was not in Holt's pocket the way the county judge was, but he was cautious in the way that underfunded, understaffed small-town law enforcement tends to be cautious, aware of the limits of his authority and the realities of power in the county. He took down what Cole reported, said he would look into it, and gave Cole the careful, non-committal response of a man who was not refusing to help, but was also not promising anything robust. Cole also went to see a man named Thomas Whitfield, who was a lawyer in Harrow Creek, one of only 2 in the county, and who had been quietly collecting documentation of Holt's practices for 2 years, because he believed that at some point the weight of accumulated evidence would outrun the influence of bought judges and intimidated officials. Cole sat with Whitfield for 2 hours and went through everything related to Eliza's situation: the disputed debt, the auction manipulation, the trespassing riders, the water rights, all of it. He told Eliza about it that evening on her porch, laying out what Whitfield had said, which was cautiously encouraging. Whitfield believed there were grounds for a complaint to the district court, which was one level above the county judge and less susceptible to Holt's particular brand of influence. It would take time. It would take documentation, but it was a real avenue. Eliza listened to all of it carefully, and when he was done she said, "You spent your entire day on this." "Yes." "You should be getting paid work." He looked at her steadily. "Eliza," she stopped. "I know what I am doing with my time," he said, "and I know why." The directness of it made her breath catch. He held her gaze for a moment, and there was no ambiguity in his expression, no careful guards or deflections. Something was in his face that had been building across all these months, across every auction bench and every shared meal and every early morning with coffee and borrowed books, and it was undisguised in this particular moment. She said, "Cole," and her voice had something different in it than it usually did. "I am aware," he said quietly, "that I have spent a great deal of money and time on your behalf that could be interpreted as having particular motivations beyond principle. And do they?" He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then, "Yes." She looked at her hands. She looked at him. The evening light was doing something extraordinary with the color of his eyes, that warm amber deepening in the fading gold of the sunset. And she was aware that she had been thinking about this, specifically, for months: the warmth of him and the steadiness of him and the particular quality of care he brought to every interaction. And she had been telling herself it was gratitude or admiration or practicality when it had been, the whole time, something much simpler and much more significant. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have similar motivations." Something in him released. It was not dramatic. He did not move or reach for her hand or do anything that the moment might have warranted in a more theatrical version of this conversation. He simply exhaled, and his whole body settled differently, and he looked at her with an expression of such quiet relief and warmth that it was more moving than any grand gesture could have been. "That is good to know," he said. She laughed softly, and he almost smiled, and then he actually smiled, the full version which she had not seen before, which completely rearranged his face into something that hit her square in the chest. "You should do that more often," she said. "What?" "Smile like that." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then I might, with sufficient reason." The September auction was the one that mattered most. Garrett Holt had, in the intervening weeks, escalated his legal campaign through channels that Whitfield had anticipated but could not fully block. He had filed a claim at the county level challenging the original inheritance of Harold Calloway's land deed on the grounds of an outstanding lien, a more aggressive version of the same debt argument he had used before. And while Whitfield was preparing the response, there was a period in which the status of Eliza's primary 40 acres was technically in dispute. During that period, Holt had arranged for the entire property to be listed at the county auction for September as a contested parcel available for claim. It was a maneuver designed with the cold efficiency of a man who had done this before. If no one challenged the listing, the auction would proceed, and Holt would simply purchase the parcel at whatever price served him, and Eliza's land would be gone. The whole town knew about it by the last week of August. Eliza knew about it the moment it was filed, because Whitfield told her immediately. She went home and sat in her kitchen and looked at her father's books and her irrigation line and her growing fields, and she let herself, just for an hour, feel the full weight of the possibility of losing it. She let herself feel it because she had found that feeling things fully, rather than suppressing them, made her cleaner and clearer when she needed to act. Then she dried her face and went to find Cole. He was at the blacksmith's, helping reshoe a horse that had thrown a shoe on the road. He saw her coming and finished the task with focused efficiency, and then handed the horse back to its owner and came to her. She told him about the filing. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "Whitfield can file the district court complaint this week. I have everything he needs." Will that stop the auction? It may not stop the auction from happening, but if Whitfield has a district court injunction filed before the hammer comes down, any sale would be legally unenforceable until the injunction is resolved, which could take months. And during those months we keep documenting, keep building the case. Holt might not care about that. He might buy it at auction and simply take possession regardless of the injunction. He might try, Cole said. And his voice had something in it that was quiet but very certain. But he would have to come through me to do it, and I think he has a reasonable understanding of what that would cost him. There was something in the way he said it that was not a threat. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the measured conviction of a man who had made his decisions and was at peace with them. She looked at him standing in the street in the late August heat, dusty from working, absolutely certain, and felt something in her that was beyond gratitude or attraction, something that had the specific gravity of a long-term truth settling into its permanent place. "Cole," she said. "Yes." "Will you stay, after all of this is resolved? However it resolves, will you stay in Harrow Creek?" He looked at her with the amber eyes that had become one of the most familiar things in her world. "Where else would I go?" he said. "Whitfield filed the injunction on Thursday. It was granted by the district court on Friday, 3 days before the September auction, by a judge who was known to be both honest and unimpressed by Garrett Holt's previous influence campaigns. The injunction did not cancel the auction, but placed an immediate legal hold on any transfer of title for Eliza's primary 40 acres pending the full hearing. When the September auction came, Eliza sat beside Cole on the bench as she had every month since April, and this time the bench felt different. Not because anything about it had changed physically, but because what had grown between them over these months had reached the kind of fullness where proximity felt like its own language, where sitting beside someone was a declaration of something. Holt arrived at the auction. He saw the district court injunction paperwork that Pete Dunmore had posted on the auction board, as required by the filing. His face went the specific red of a man who is containing fury by a very thin margin. The bidding on Eliza's contested parcel opened at $20. Holt bid, Cole bid against him. The numbers climbed, 60, 70, 90, 110. At 130, Holt looked at Cole with an expression that was meant to be intimidating and discovered, as several men before him had discovered in different contexts, that Cole Aldridge was the most difficult man in Texas to intimidate because he genuinely did not appear to fear anything that Holt had the capacity to threaten. At 150, Holt paused. The pause stretched. Pete Dunmore counted. The hammer came down. Cole Aldridge purchased Eliza Calloway's land deed for $150, which under the terms of the district court injunction meant that the sale was recorded but unenforceable until the hearing, which was exactly what Whitfield had planned for. The title would remain in dispute legally, but as its holder of record during the dispute, Cole's claim would give them standing in the district court that would be much harder to dismiss than a lone woman's appeal. And then Whitfield did what he had been building toward for 2 years. The district court hearing happened in November, and Whitfield brought 4 years of documented incidents, witness statements from the Ruiz family and 2 of the other displaced homesteaders, financial records demonstrating the pattern of debt manipulation, and the testimony of a county records clerk who had, after considerable moral deliberation, agreed to testify about a document he had been pressured to file improperly on Holt's behalf. It was, even in the standards of the 1878 frontier, where justice was an inconsistent and often partial thing, a compelling case. The district judge ruled that the original debt claim against Harold Calloway's estate had been filed fraudulently, that the auction listing of Eliza's primary property was therefore void, and that title reverted fully and without encumbrance to Eliza Calloway as rightful heir. Garrett Holt's legal campaign was over. The county was not done with Holt entirely. The Ruiz case and 2 others were referred to the federal level, where they would proceed slowly through the machinery of Reconstruction-era enforcement, and Holt was facing the particular purgatory of a powerful man whose power had been publicly shown to have limits. He did not leave the county. He did not become a good man. But he was diminished in the way that men who rely on fear and corruption are diminished when those tools are taken away, and the hold he had exercised over the eastern part of the county loosened enough that people breathed differently. Eliza received the court ruling on a Tuesday morning in November and sat at her kitchen table with the paperwork in front of her and cried for a full 10 minutes, which she had entirely earned. Then she washed her face and put on her good coat and drove to town. She found Cole at Me's boarding house, eating lunch, and she sat down across from him and put the court ruling on the table and said nothing. He read it. He looked up. The expression on his face was something she would keep for the rest of her life, a warm, undisguised relief and something beneath it that was close to joy. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he agreed. "I have a great deal of money to pay you back," she said. "The auction funds, the spring items, the water pump. I have been keeping the accounting." "I know you have, Cole." She looked at him directly, the way she had learned to over these months, because he responded to directness, because he was a direct person himself and it met him well. "I have also been keeping another kind of accounting, of who you are to me now, and what it would mean if you were not." His hands were still on the table, resting on either side of the court document. He looked at her with those amber eyes that were steady and warm and had the quality of deep water. "Tell me," he said, "what it would mean." "It would mean a very significant loss," she said, "more significant than any property, more significant than any harvest." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been wanting to ask you something since about the 3rd auction. You have had considerable patience. I have been waiting for the circumstances to be right. Are they right now?" He looked around Me's boarding house, which had perhaps a dozen people in it, most of whom were watching them with varying levels of discretion. "Not especially," he said, "but I find I am not willing to wait any longer." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was the first time he had touched her in any way that was not functional or incidental, and the warmth of his hand was extraordinary, the kind of warmth that is not just temperature but everything else, the steadiness, the deliberateness, the years of morning coffees and auction benches and shared labor and borrowed books compressed into a single point of contact. "Eliza," he said, "I would like to court you properly with your permission, and I am asking because I intend to do it in the way that means something and not the way that is a formality." She turned her hand so that it was no longer resting under his but holding his, fingers interlaced. "You have been courting me since April," she said. "I have been counting." The full smile came, the one that rearranged his face. 7 months, he said. 7 months, she confirmed. "You are, for the record, very thorough about it." They laughed, which startled some of the more attentive audience members at adjacent tables, because neither of them was known as a person who laughed easily, and hearing them do it in concert was its own particular event. The rest of November and all of December were a different kind of time. With Holt's campaign over and her land secured, and the winter slowing the agricultural demands, Eliza had the unusual experience of a present that did not require constant crisis management, and what that left room for was Cole. He came to her property most evenings after his work was done. Sometimes he had a practical purpose, a fence repair, some winter maintenance on the irrigation pipes, a discussion about the spring planting strategy. But increasingly the practical purpose was just the pretext, and both of them knew it, and neither of them minded. They would work for a while and then sit on the porch in the cold evening air with blankets and coffee, and they would talk about everything, about books in Kansas and Galveston, and what they believed about the land and the future, and the particular strange gift, and challenge of being alive in the American West in 1878, where everything was simultaneously possible and precarious, and full of a beauty that could break your heart if you let it. He brought her a book he had managed to acquire from a traveling merchant, a collection of essays, and she cried a little when she opened it because it was not a thing she had expected, and he looked slightly alarmed by the crying until she explained that it was the good kind. And then he relaxed, and she could see that he had thought carefully about bringing it and had been nervous, and she found that the nervousness in him, which he usually hid so well, was one of the most endearing things about him. One evening in mid-December, when the temperature had dropped and the plains were dark and still under a vast cold sky that blazed with stars, they were sitting on the porch with the blankets pulled close and the lamp burning low behind them through the window, and he said something that had been working its way toward the surface for months. "I want to build something here," he said. "Not just work for hire. I want land of my own, something adjacent to yours if there is a parcel available. I want to stop renting a room above a livery and start building the kind of life that has some permanence to it." She was quiet for a moment, listening to the stars in the way you can almost do when everything is sufficiently still. "The Calloway parcel has 40 acres, she said, "and the river strip, which is 3 more. A man working a homestead claim could take an adjacent 60-acre parcel to the north, which I happen to know is available because I checked the county register last week." He turned to look at her. "You checked the register, purely for informational purposes. Last week?" "Yes." He studied her in the lamplight coming through the window, the planes of her face, the dark hair, the particular quality of intelligence and warmth in her eyes. "Eliza," he said. "Cole," she said. "I am going to ask you something that requires more deliberation than the courtship question and a better setting than me's boarding house, and I want you to know that I am going to ask it properly." She looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing something that was entirely undignified, and she was grateful for the dark. "All right," she said. "I am telling you in advance because I do not want you to be caught off guard when I do. I appreciate the warning." "Good." He looked back at the stars. Then, quietly, "I also want you to know that regardless of your answer, I would do every auction and every morning and every evening over again exactly as they were, without question." She felt the full weight of that, the months of it, the investment of it, not the money but the other kind, the kind that was made of time and attention and presence, the kind that could not be returned if she declined. He was telling her that he had given it without condition, that it was not a transaction, that it had been freely given before she had agreed to anything. She reached out and found his hand under the blanket and held it. "I already know my answer," she said. He was quiet. "And it is yes," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his expression was so unguarded and so full that she felt it in her bones. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly against the side of his face, the gesture so simple and so intimate that she caught her breath, and then he said very quietly, "Thank you," which was exactly the right thing. January came cold and bright to Harrow Creek. Cole asked her properly on the first day of the new year, which was 1879, standing on the bank of the river access strip that he had helped her keep, the water running low and clear under the winter sky, with a ring he had made himself from a piece of silver wire that he had bent carefully into shape, and that was not elaborate but was exactly right because it was his, made by his hands that had worked her land and carried her equipment and built her irrigation line. She said yes again. She had been saying yes since April without using the word. They were married in March at the Harrow Creek Community Church by Reverend Callahan, who gave a sermon that was considerably shorter than his usual ones, because he knew both Cole and Eliza well enough to know they preferred efficiency. The whole town came, which was both a testament to how much the community had come to care about what Eliza and Cole's struggle had meant collectively, and also because there was very little entertainment in Harrow Creek in March, and a wedding was something worth attending. Me Hendricks cried through the entire ceremony, which she excused by saying she had something in both eyes. Thomas Whitfield shook Cole's hand afterward with the sincerity of a man who felt he had played his own part in making this possible. Pete Dunmore, who had watched all of it unfold from his auction platform month by month, said to anyone who would listen that he had known from the very first auction that something was going to come of those two sitting together on that bench. Garrett Holt was not at the wedding. He was, at that moment, in the early stages of the federal proceedings that Whitfield and the district court ruling had helped initiate, and while those proceedings would not resolve quickly, they were real, and they had the weight of something that could not be bought off or intimidated away. It was not full justice. It was never full justice in 1879 Texas for every wrong that Holt had done. But it was the beginning of accountability, which was more than most had managed against him. Cole filed his homestead claim on the 60 acres to the north of Eliza's property in February, and once they were married and their properties were adjacent, the combined 100+ acres had the character of something that could genuinely support a future. Cole had a little money left from his cattle drive savings, and Eliza had her harvest income, and together they made careful, deliberate plans for the spring planting that built on what she had learned in her first year and what he knew from Kansas. The spring of 1879 was the first season they worked the land together from the beginning. It was different. Not just practically, though it was practically different in every way, more efficient, better planned, the shared labor making possible things that neither of them could have done alone. It was different in the texture of the days. Waking before sunrise to the particular quality of the pre-dawn air, drinking coffee together before going out to start the morning work, the rhythm of shared effort that has a specific satisfaction when it is with someone you love, each person reading the other's needs without having to ask, moving around each other in the fields and the barn, and the kitchen with the ease of people who have found their natural alignment. In the evenings they sat together and read, sometimes aloud, sometimes in their own respective silence, and Cole had borrowed every book on her shelf at least once, and had developed particular opinions about Dickens that he expressed with unexpected passion, which she found genuinely delightful. By summer, the corn was the best she had yet produced, and the expanded planting on Cole's adjacent acres had a strong bean yield and some early wheat that showed real promise for the following year. They hired one hand, a young man named Javier who had come to the county from New Mexico, and who was 20 years old and capable and grateful for steady work with people who paid fairly and treated him with respect. Javier turned out to have an extraordinary instinct for horses, and by August Cole had begun talking with him about a potential horse-breaking operation as a side venture, which was something the county needed, and which could bring in additional income during the winter months. The August auction was the last one that Cole formally sat beside Eliza, with any sense of ongoing threat. He had come to every auction since April of 1878, a year and a half of monthly Saturdays, always there, always beside her, always certain. This particular auction had nothing of her land or equipment or livelihood on the line. They came simply as members of the community, bidding on a few small useful things, talking with neighbors. But he sat beside her anyway, the way he always had, and she leaned slightly against his shoulder at one point in the way she had begun to do recently without thinking about it, and he reached sideways and rested his hand over hers on her knee, and it had none of the tension of those earlier auctions but all of the same certainty. After the auction, walking back to where Cassia was tied alongside Eliza's wagon and Arthur, Cole said, "Do you remember the first auction?" "Every detail," she said. "What did you think of me?" She considered. "I thought you were deliberate and quiet, and that I could not tell whether you were kind or simply practical. And now, I know you are both," she said, "in equal measure and in the right proportion." He helped her up onto the wagon seat, as he always did now, his hand at her waist, and then climbed up beside her, and they drove back along the northeast road in the August heat with the plains gold around them, and the sky that enormous, uncontainable blue. In September, Eliza realized she was expecting a child. She told Cole on a Sunday morning while they were having breakfast, sitting across the table from each other with the light coming through the east window and the sound of Javier doing the morning work in the barn outside. She said it simply and clearly, watching his face. He went very still for a moment. Then something in his face did something she had only seen it do a handful of times, opened completely, with no guards at all, every feeling visible. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way that he was not going to apologize for. "Truly," he said. "March, I think." He got up from his side of the table and came around, and she stood, and he put his arms around her and held her with the careful, fierce gentleness of a man who had just understood something new about the magnitude of his life. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the whole of the year behind them and the whole of what was ahead. And it was overwhelming and extraordinary and exactly right. They told me Hendricks first, who burst into tears and then immediately began planning a gift. They told Whitfield, who offered his sincere congratulations and reported that the federal proceedings against Holt had reached an important new stage. They told Javier, who was visibly moved and immediately offered to take on additional duties to ensure that Eliza was not overworking as the pregnancy progressed, which she thanked him for, and then gently reminded him that she was capable of determining her own limitations. The winter of 1879, moving into 1880, was the most contented period of Cole's life that he could remember. The work continued, the planning for the spring, the horse-breaking operation with Javier, which had attracted 3 clients in its first months, the careful management of the expanded land. But what overlaid all of it was the warmth of the house that had become genuinely theirs, the evenings with books and conversation, the specific joy of watching Eliza's face in the mornings when she was thinking about something, the way the pregnancy seemed to have added a quality of radiance to her that he told her about once, expecting her to dismiss it as sentiment. And she surprised him by saying quietly that she felt different, fuller in some way that had nothing to do with the physical, and that she thought it was because the fear that had characterized her first year in Harrow Creek had finally, genuinely, left. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his the way he had done at Me's that November day a year before. "It should have left sooner," he said. "It left when it was time," she said. "When I had enough reason." He looked at her steadily. "You always had enough reason. You had your land, your work, your own capability." "Yes," she said, "but reason and feeling are different things. The feeling of safety, the feeling of not being alone, those came later. Those came with you." He said nothing. He simply held her hand and looked at her with that amber gaze, and she felt, as she had increasingly come to feel, that his silence in these moments was not absence but its opposite, a very full and attentive presence that needed no words to make itself understood. The baby came in late March of 1880, a boy, born on a Tuesday morning with Cole holding Eliza's hand on one side and me Hendricks standing in her capacity as the town's most experienced midwife on the other. And the whole birth was conducted with the focused intensity that both Cole and Eliza brought to everything they did. And when it was over and the baby was placed in Eliza's arms, Cole sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with the expression of a man entirely undone in the best possible way. They named him Harold, for Eliza's uncle, whose land had brought her to this place and this life. Harold Cole Aldridge, and even the naming of him had a quality of completed circles, every thread drawing back to itself. Me Hendricks held the baby for about 4 minutes before Cole gently reclaimed him, and she told everyone in town about it for weeks, about the way Cole held his son with such quiet certainty, the same quality he brought to everything, the same sense of a man who had found the precise place where he belonged and intended to stay there. The spring planting of 1880 was managed with Javier taking on a larger role, while Cole divided his time between the fields and the house, where Eliza was recovering, and Harold was learning the early vocabulary of existence. Javier, who had by this point become genuinely part of the household in the way of someone who worked alongside people they respected, and who respected them in turn, proved himself fully capable of leading the field work, and Cole trusted him enough to leave the corn section entirely in his management. By summer, Harold was growing at the enthusiastic rate that babies grow when they are well loved and well fed, and the farm was producing a yield that significantly exceeded the previous 2 years, and the horse-breaking operation had expanded to the point where Cole was considering taking on a second hand, specifically for that aspect of the work. The Harrow Creek auction in July of 1880, the 2-year mark from that first April when Cole had sat beside a frightened young woman who refused to show her fear, was an unremarkable Saturday morning full of ordinary commerce and community. Eliza came with Harold in a sling across her chest, which was a reasonably modern adaptation of a practice she had seen among several of the Mexican and indigenous families in the area, and had decided was entirely sensible. She sat beside Cole on the auction bench, and Harold slept against her with the boneless trust of a 6-month-old in a safe place. Cole looked at them sideways at one point, his wife and his son, in the summer morning at the auction where everything had begun, and something crossed his face that was too large for any single emotion to contain. Eliza caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "That is the least convincing nothing I have ever heard." He looked back at the platform. "I was thinking about the first time I sat here." She was quiet for a moment. "You saved my plow," she said. "You let me." "I did not have much choice." "You could have refused," she smiled. "I could have tried. You would have simply done it anyway." He glanced at her again, and the almost smile was there, the one she had learned to read as everything it prefaced. "Probably," he admitted. She leaned against his shoulder, Harold warm and heavy between them, and he put his arm around her in the easy, natural way of two people who had long since stopped needing to measure the distance between themselves. The auction went on around them. Pete Dunmore called items and prices in his carrying voice. People bid, some won, some lost with grace and some without, and the commerce of a small frontier town conducted itself in its ordinary necessary way. Thomas Whitfield found them afterward and delivered the news he had been waiting to deliver in person, rather than by letter. The federal case against Garrett Holt had resulted in a significant finding. Holt was required to restore compensation to the Ruiz family and 2 other displaced homesteaders, a sum substantial enough to represent genuine consequence, and the additional documentation regarding his manipulation of county legal processes had resulted in the removal of the county judge from his position. It was not, Whitfield said with the careful honesty of a man who had been in law long enough to know its limits, everything that should have happened. It was not the full accounting for every wrong, but it was real, it was documented, it was a matter of public record. The Ruiz family, who had been living in difficult circumstances since their displacement, had received enough in the settlement to begin rebuilding. They had sent Whitfield a letter that he read aloud in his office that day, and in the reading of it, Eliza cried and did not try to hide it, and Whitfield had to pause twice himself, and Cole sat straight and still in his chair with his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is feeling things deeply and processing them internally because that was his nature, but whose eyes were very bright. The September auction of 1880 was the last one that bore any relationship to the crisis that had defined the previous 2 years. Eliza's land was secure. Cole's adjacent claim was well established. The debt and the manipulated liens and the contested listings were all resolved and closed. Garrett Holt, diminished by legal consequence and the public record of his practices, had pulled back from his county expansion ambitions, at least for the foreseeable future. He was still present, still prosperous enough, still unpleasant, but the particular predatory campaign that had nearly cost Eliza everything was definitively over. They came to the auction that September not out of necessity but out of habit, out of community, out of the simple fact that the first Saturday of the month was a gathering, and Eliza had come to value gathering, the people of Harrow Creek who had witnessed her first year, and who had, in their various ways, made up the texture of a life rebuilt from scratch. Me Hendricks, who was Harold's devoted unofficial grandmother. Thomas Whitfield, who had believed in the law even when the law was being used against it. Javier, who was there with a couple of his own horses now, having used his wages to purchase 2 young mares that he was training with the quiet excellence that characterized everything he did. Pete Dunmore, who had run these auctions for 9 years and would run them for 9 more, and who had seen, from his platform, what this community was made of. Cole sat beside Eliza on the bench as he always had. Harold was old enough by September to sit on his father's knee and look at the platform with the wide-eyed attention of a 7-month-old encountering the world as an inexhaustible source of interest. Cole held him with one arm and his other arm was around Eliza, and the 3 of them fit together on that bench in the morning sun, with the ease of people who have arrived at the place they were meant to be. After the auction, they walked back to their wagon together, and Javier, who was loading his horses into a small trailer with the efficient expertise he brought to horses, paused to say goodbye and mentioned that he had been approached by a rancher in the next county about a horse-breaking contract that would run for 3 months and pay well. Cole listened to the whole of it and then said, "Take it. We have managed before. And I want you to build your own operation, not just work inside ours." Javier looked at him steadily. "You mean that?" "I do." Something in Javier's face shifted, the particular expression of a young man who has been treated with respect at an age and in a context where that was far from guaranteed. "I would come back," he said. "I know you would," Cole said, "and the place will be here." On the drive home, Harold asleep in the basket behind the seat, the plains golden in the early afternoon, the irrigation line visible in the distance doing its steady work, Eliza said, "That was kind, what you said to Javier." "He is good," Cole said. "He deserves room." She looked at him, this man whose quality of goodness was never performative, never announced, always simply present in the way he moved through the world. "You know," she said, "in the beginning I thought I was letting you help me because I had no other choice. And now I understand that I was letting you help me because I recognized something in you that was worth the vulnerability of allowing it." He glanced at her sideways. "That is a complicated way to say it. I am a complicated person." "You are," he agreed, with a warmth that made the word a compliment of the highest order. "You are the most interesting person I have ever known." She reached over and rested her hand on his arm where he was holding the reins, and he adjusted his grip so that she could tuck her hand into the space between his arm and his side. And they drove home that way, together, with Harold sleeping behind them, and the land spread out around them. Everything they had fought for and built. The fields and the fences and the irrigation lines and the horses in the pasture, and the small barn, and the house with the bookshelf full of her father's books and his borrowed editions. All of it visible as they came up the northeast road. Winter came to Harrow Creek again, the second winter they spent fully settled and secure, and it had a different quality than the previous winters. Not softer exactly. The Texas plains were still cold and wide in December. The wind still had its particular cutting edge, and there were mornings when the frost sat white on everything, and the water in the basin took a long time to warm. But it was a winter they moved through together, with certainty about the spring that would follow it. Cole had begun building an extension on the house in October, a second room that would serve as a proper bedroom for Harold as he grew and potentially for any future additions to the family, which was a subject they discussed with the practical openness they brought to most things. He worked on the extension in the afternoons when the outdoor work was slower, and Eliza brought him coffee at about 3 o'clock every day and sometimes stayed to help with the less technical aspects of the construction. And Harold, now mobile in the limited rolling way of a baby approaching crawling, would sit in a box of sawdust watching with enormous interested eyes. Me Hendricks came to dinner on Sunday evenings, which had become a fixed tradition. She was 61, a widow who had been in Harrow Creek for 15 years and knew everyone and everything, and her presence at their table had a quality that Cole had come to value in a particular way, not just for Eliza's sake, but for his own, the warmth of a household that included people beyond just the immediate family, the sense of belonging to a community rather than just occupying a piece of land. In January of 1881, Eliza told Cole she was expecting again. This one, she said, felt different from the very beginning, quieter, more inward. She was right. Their daughter was born in August of 1881, a warm, quiet August night with the crickets loud outside and the air thick with the smell of the hay harvest, and she came into the world with the complete calm of someone who had all the time she needed. They named her Clara, which had been Eliza's mother's name, and the completion of that circle had a grace to it that made Cole hold his daughter in the first hour of her life with such visible wonder that Mee Hendricks, who had attended the birth again, said afterward that she had seen many fathers in her life, but very few who looked at their children the way Cole Aldridge looked at his. Harold, who was 16 months old and had been with Javier in the barn during the birth, was introduced to his sister the following morning in the soft new light, and he looked at her with the particular intense concentration of a small child encountering something entirely new, and then patted her very gently on the top of her head with his whole palm in a gesture that was both possessive and tender. "Gentle," Eliza said softly. Harold looked at his mother. He patted the baby again, only slightly more gently. Cole watched this from the doorway of the room, his shoulder against the frame, his arms crossed. Something in his chest was almost too full to contain. This, all of this. The house his hands had built and extended, the land they had fought for and won, the woman who was the center of everything, the children who were the future of it, the morning coming gold through the windows of a home that was entirely, permanently, undeniably theirs. He thought about April of 1878, a stranger on a bench beside a woman who was trying not to show her fear. A plow, $30, the most significant investment of his life, not for what it cost but for what it began. Eliza looked up from the bed and found him in the doorway. She had the particular exhausted radiance of a woman who had just done something extraordinary and knew it. She held his gaze across the room with the directness that had always been one of his favorite things about her. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the bed and looked at Clara, who was very small and very present and who had her mother's dark hair and Cole thought was already showing the particular quality of quiet intensity that seemed to run in his own family. "She looks like you," Eliza said. "She looks like herself," he said. "She will decide later who else she looks like." Eliza smiled. Harold had settled against Cole's leg and was regarding his sister with ongoing serious study. Outside, the August morning was coming up fully, the birds loud, the fields catching the early light. Eliza rested her head against Cole's shoulder. He put his arm around her, careful of Clara between them, and held his family with the same steady certainty he had always brought to the things that mattered. "Cole," she said, quietly. "Yes. I want to tell you something. Tell me." She was quiet for a moment, finding the words for something that had been accumulating for 3 years. "When I came to Harrow Creek, I was trying to survive. That was the whole of my goal. Keep the land, make it work, do not give up. And you walked into that and you made it something different. You made it not just surviving, but actually living, actually being in a life instead of just maintaining one." He was quiet. Harold had apparently decided his sister was adequately examined and had found a loose thread on Cole's shirt pocket of absorbing interest. "I want you to know that I know that," Eliza said. "That I understand what you gave me. The money was part of it, and I will not dismiss the practical significance of that. But the other part, the being beside me, the staying, the choosing this and choosing me, that is the thing I carry." His arm tightened slightly around her. "You gave me the same thing," he said, his voice low and quiet. "You gave me a reason for the staying." She looked up at him. "You had principle. You had the principle of opposing what Holt was doing. Principle can take a man a long way," he said. "It brought me to the first auction, but principle alone does not keep a man at a bench every single month. That was you." She held his gaze for a moment with all the things she felt very present in her face, the love and the gratitude and the history of it, and then she leaned her head back against his shoulder and let the morning come around them. The October auction of 1881 was held on a crisp, bright Saturday that smelled of fall, the first cool edge in the air that Harrow Creek always got in mid-October, a preview of the winter months ahead. Clara was 2 months old and not yet at the auction, staying with me Hendricks in town, and Harold was with Javier, who had returned from his contract and was now managing the horse-breaking side of the operation with 2 additional young horses they had purchased in the spring. Cole and Eliza walked to the auction together, their hands loosely linked, in the way they had walked to town on every first Saturday for 3 years. The morning was ordinary and extraordinary in the same measure that all their mornings had become, grounded in the ordinary work of a life lived with intention and filled with the extraordinary fact of each other. Pete Dunmore called the auction to order from his platform and began the morning's listings, and Cole and Eliza settled onto the bench that they had claimed as their own in the understanding of everyone in Harrow Creek who had ever paid attention. Their bench, the place where everything had started. She leaned into him slightly. He reached across and covered her hand with his. The auction went on around them, the ordinary commerce of a frontier town in 1881, and they were part of it, fully and contentedly part of it. This community that had witnessed their struggle and celebrated their survival and watched them build a life from 40 acres and a plow and a single act of deliberate kindness on a spring morning 3.5 years ago. After the auction, they collected Clara from me and Harold from Javier and drove home along the northeast road in the full October afternoon, and the land was gold and blue around them in that particular way that the Texas plains are gold and blue in October, and everything was resolved, and everything was whole, and everything that had been fought for was kept, and the life that they had built together was exactly as permanent and exactly as good as the day they had planted the first seed in it. Cole glanced at Eliza beside him on the wagon seat, Clara in the basket between them, Harold asleep against his mother's side. She was watching the road ahead with the expression she got when she was quietly content, not joyful in the exuberant sense but settled into a deep, warm satisfaction that had no anxiety underneath it. She felt his gaze and looked at him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. And this time she knew it was true, and it was the best possible truth, the nothing that meant everything was right, everything was present, everything was exactly where it belonged. She smiled and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they drove home through the golden afternoon. The northeast road was just as it had always been, a little rough in the same places, the loose bridge plank long since replaced by coal on a Tuesday afternoon 2 years ago, the river visible in the distance, the fields on either side of the property line showing the work of 3 years of careful tending. Arthur and Beatrice were in the pasture, which was proper and right. The irrigation line ran clear. The extension on the house stood solid. The barn was sound. Javier's horses in their enclosure were the beginning of something that would grow into its own entity in the years ahead, a proper horse-breaking and trading operation that would be part of the Aldridge land's identity and contribution to the county. And inside the house, the bookshelf held Eliza's father's books and Cole's editions, and Harold would learn to read from both of them, and Clara after him, and the evenings would continue as they had begun, with the lamp burning and the pages turning, and 2 people side by side in the way that was the most truthful and permanent version of themselves. It had started with an auction and a plow and a man who sat down beside a woman who needed someone to stay. It had become everything.